Hi guys, the night air over the Nile River was still warm, even after the sun had gone down. A soft wind moved slowly across the dark water. Reeds bent gently near the muddy riverbanks. Far away, a dog barked once, then everything became quiet again. The sky above ancient Egypt stretched wide and deep, filled with stars that flickered softly over the sleeping land. Most homes had already gone dark. In narrow villages built from mud brick and packed earth, families rested close together beneath simple woven blankets. Some slept on reed mats laid across hard floors. Others rested on low wooden beds raised slightly above the ground to escape insects that wandered during the night. The smell of ash from evening cooking fires still drifted softly through the air. Inside one small home, a mother slept beside her children while warm desert wind slipped quietly through an open window. A clay jar of river water stood near the doorway. Sandals rested beside the wall. In one corner sat a basket filled with onions and coarse bread left over from the evening meal. Outside, the village was silent except for the soft sound of insects and the distant movement of river water against wooden fishing boats tied along the shore. Ancient Egypt often looked peaceful at night. And in many ways, it was. The Nile carried life gently through the land year after year. Crops grew along its banks. Families worked, ate, slept, and repeated the same routines their parents had once followed. The rhythm of life moved slowly with the flooding river, the rising sun, and the changing seasons. But beneath this calm and ordered world was another truth. Life in Egypt was quiet because nearly everything was controlled. The farmers who woke before sunrise did not truly own the fields they worked. The laborers who carried stone beneath the burning heat could not simply leave. The scribes who recorded grain taxes watched carefully over every measure and number. Even the movement of river water was observed, counted, and planned. Egypt was calm because everyone knew their place. The fisherman knew where he stood. The servant knew where she stood. The builder knew where he stood. And above them all stood the officials, priests, and royal administrators who quietly guided the great machine of the kingdom. Most people never questioned this order. The system was older than their grandparents. Older than memory itself. It was simply the way the world had always been. And so the days moved forward slowly. Very slowly. Long before the first light touched the Nile, workers were already beginning to stir inside their homes. The coolest hours came before sunrise, and many laborers preferred to start early before the heavy heat arrived. In darkness, sleepy figures sat up from their mats and rubbed tired eyes while faint blue light slowly appeared along the horizon. Roosters cried somewhere beyond the village walls. A woman knelt beside a grinding stone and began crushing grain into flour with slow practiced movements. The rough sound of stone against grain filled the room softly. Beside her, a clay oven still held warmth from the previous night. Soon the smell of baking bread drifted into the cool morning air. Nearby, her husband tied simple linen clothing around his waist and prepared for another day in the fields. His body already ached before the work had even begun. His hands were rough and cracked from years beneath the sun. Small scars crossed his arms from tools, rope, and stone. Outside, other villagers were waking too. Doors creaked open. Sandals scraped against dusty ground. Donkeys shifted beneath heavy baskets. Children carried water jars toward the river while older men quietly prepared wooden plows and farming tools worn smooth by long use. The village slowly came alive beneath fading stars. No one moved quickly. There was no reason to hurry. The same work waited every day. The Nile determined nearly everything in Egyptian life. Its floods brought rich black soil that allowed crops to grow in the middle of endless desert. Without the river, the land would have become dry, empty, and silent. Because the river was so important, the kingdom watched it carefully. Officials measured flood levels each year. Scribes recorded harvest estimates. Grain storage was tracked closely. Taxes depended on how much the fields produced, and the state wanted accurate numbers. A farmer could not simply grow what he wished and disappear into the countryside unnoticed. Someone was always counting. Someone was always recording. In small government buildings near larger towns, scribes sat cross-legged with brushes and papyrus scrolls spread before them. They worked in shaded rooms where the air smelled faintly of ink, dust, and warm reeds. Outside, the streets baked beneath the growing heat. Inside, scribes dipped brushes carefully and copied endless records in neat black lines. Names. Land measurements. Grain deliveries. Work assignments. Tax collections. Everything moved through written records. To most ordinary people, scribes seemed almost mysterious. Many farmers could not read or write. Symbols on papyrus looked magical and distant, belonging to a quieter world of counting and control. Scribes rarely performed heavy labor, but their work carried power. A small mark of ink could determine how much grain a family owed. A missing record might bring punishment. A corrected number could change a worker's life for months. And yet the scribes themselves often lived quiet and repetitive lives too. Many spent long days bent over low desks while sunlight crept slowly across stone floors. Their backs stiffened from sitting. Their fingers darkened with ink stains. Their eyes grew tired from staring at symbols hour after hour. Even those with respected positions lived inside the same system of order and obedience. The kingdom depended on routine. Everything depended on routine. As morning sunlight spread across the Nile Valley, boats began drifting along the river. Some carried fish packed in woven baskets. Others transported jars of beer, bundles of reeds, or sacks of grain. The river was Egypt's great road. Travel across desert land was difficult and exhausting, but boats moved smoothly with the current and wind. Sailcloth fluttered softly above dark wooden hulls while workers guided vessels carefully through the water. Along the riverbanks, fishermen cast nets into shallow waters where reeds sway gently in the breeze. Fishing was hard work, though it appeared peaceful from a distance. Men stood ankle-deep in mud beneath rising heat while insects buzzed endlessly around them. Wet nets grew heavy with river water. The smell of fish clung to skin and clothing long after the work ended. Still, the Nile fed the people. And so the fishermen returned each morning before dawn. Nearby, women washed clothing at the river's edge. Children splashed quietly beside them while older girls filled heavy jars with water to carry home. The riverbank was crowded but calm. Voices stayed low beneath the growing heat of day. By midday, the air became heavy. The desert sun ruled everything. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads. Farmers bent low over fields of barley and emmer wheat while sweat darkened their linen garments. Oxen pulled wooden plows slowly through damp soil. Insects circled constantly around both animals and people. The work never truly stopped. Even during quieter seasons, there were walls to repair, canals to clear, baskets to weave, grain to grind, roofs to patch, tools to sharpen. Egyptian life was filled with maintenance. Mud brick homes cracked beneath heat and needed repair. Irrigation channels filled with silt and required cleaning. Boats weakened with age. Rope frayed. Sand drifted everywhere. Nothing remained untouched by time and dust. And above all of this hovered the quiet presence of authority. Officials traveled between villages collecting taxes and checking records. Priests supervised temple lands. Overseers watched labor crews carefully. Most people obeyed because disobedience brought danger. Punishments in ancient Egypt could be harsh, though they were often carried out quietly and without drama. A worker who failed his duties might lose food rations. A farmer who hid grain could be beaten. A laborer who abandoned assigned work might face severe consequences from local authorities. Fear did not always need to be loud. Sometimes it existed simply as understanding. Everyone knew what could happen. So the villages remained orderly. The roads remained orderly. The river remained orderly. And life continued with slow predictability. During the hottest hours of afternoon, many workers paused briefly beneath shade whenever possible. Farmers rested beside mud walls. Boatmen sat beneath folded sails. Builders drank water slowly while dust clung to their skin. The heat in Egypt could feel endless. Stone walls radiated warmth long after sunset. Sand burned bare feet. Even breathing felt heavy during certain months when the air stood still over the valley. Yet work continued because the kingdom required constant labor. Large building projects rose steadily across Egypt for generations. Temples expanded. Tombs deepened into cliffs. Statues towered over courtyards filled with drifting incense smoke. Most of this work was completed not by slaves in chains, as many later stories imagined, but by organized laborers working under strict systems of obligation and control. Some workers were paid with food, beer, linen, and shelter. Others were required to provide labor as a duty to the state. Villages of workers appeared near major construction sites. Rows of simple homes housed stonecutters, painters, haulers, and craftsmen whose lives revolved entirely around the project assigned to them. These settlements had their own routines. At sunrise, crews gathered beneath the watchful eyes of foremen. Tools were distributed carefully. Attendance was recorded. Missing workers were noticed immediately. Then the labor began. Stone blocks scraped across wooden sledges. Hammers struck rock walls in steady rhythms. Dust rose into the bright air. Voices echoed softly through unfinished chambers. The work demanded patience more than speed. Day after day, year after year, the same motions repeated beneath the sun. Workers often suffered injuries. Hands blistered. Backs bent painfully. Eyes burned from bright limestone dust. Some men coughed constantly from breathing fine particles inside narrow workspaces. But even exhaustion became part of routine. At night, workers returned slowly to their homes carrying tired bodies through narrow streets lined with flickering oil lamps. Families cooked simple meals over small fires while conversations drifted lazily through the darkness. Bread, beer, onions, lentils, fish when available. Most meals remained modest and repetitive, though warm food after a long day brought quiet comfort. Children fell asleep quickly beside their parents while insects hummed outside. Then the cycle began again the next morning. For women in ancient Egypt, life also followed endless rhythms of labor and responsibility. Before dawn, many were already awake grinding grain into flour. This difficult work consumed hours each day. Kneeling beside grinding stones placed enormous strain on backs, knees, and shoulders over time. Archaeologists thousands of years later would discover skeletons showing heavy wear from these repetitive movements. But in those ancient mornings, the women themselves likely thought little about it. It was simply life. After grinding grain came baking, brewing beer, cleaning, weaving cloth, caring for children, carrying water, tending animals, repairing clothing, preparing meals, and managing the constant small needs of the household. The work inside the home never truly ended. During cooler evening hours, Women sometimes gathered outside together while children played nearby in dusty streets. Voices stayed soft beneath fading sunlight. Some mended clothing. Others braided hair or sorted vegetables by lantern glow. For brief moments, life slowed. Yet even these peaceful gatherings existed within carefully ordered social rules. Egyptian society valued stability deeply. Families were expected to fulfill their duties quietly. Respect toward authority, toward elders, toward tradition, shaped daily behavior from childhood onward. People learned early not to disturb the balance of life around them. A son often followed his father's trade. A daughter learned the work of her mother. The system renewed itself generation after generation. Near larger cities, markets filled with merchants selling goods brought from across Egypt and beyond. The smell of spices, fish, warm bread, sweat, animals, and river mud blended together beneath crowded awnings. Donkeys pushed slowly through narrow streets carrying baskets of grain or pottery jars. Vendors called softly to passing customers. Scribes sat nearby recording sales and deliveries. Even commerce remained carefully watched. Taxes reached into nearly every corner of Egyptian life. Grain taxes, labor taxes, goods transported along the Nile, temple offerings. The state depended on these resources to support officials, priests, soldiers, builders, and enormous public projects. And because taxes mattered so much, accurate records mattered too. So the scribes continued writing. Always writing. In government storehouses, grain rose in towering piles beneath thick mud brick walls designed to keep supplies dry. Workers carried heavy sacks across wooden ramps while overseers counted carefully. The grain belonged partly to the state now. A farmer might spend months tending crops only to see large portions measured out for taxation after harvest. Yet open rebellion remained rare during stable periods of Egyptian history. Not because life was easy, but because order surrounded everything from birth onward. Religion strengthened this feeling deeply. Egyptians believed the universe itself depended on balance and harmony. The concept of order touched both government and spiritual life together. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler. He represented stability itself, maintaining harmony between gods, nature, and society. To challenge authority could feel like challenging the natural order of the world. So most people endured their burdens quietly. They woke before sunrise, worked beneath heavy heat, returned home exhausted, slept briefly, and rose again. Years passed softly this way. The Nile flooded and receded. Children grew older. Parents aged. Fields changed with the seasons. And always the kingdom continued watching, measuring, recording, organizing. Even death itself entered this world of careful control. Funeral preparations in Egypt followed traditions so ancient that many people likely performed them without fully questioning why. Bodies were washed carefully. Linen wrappings covered the dead in layer after layer. Priests spoke familiar prayers beneath drifting incense smoke. Families mourned quietly. Yet burial customs also revealed deep social differences. Wealthy officials rested in elaborate tombs decorated with painted scenes of eternal comfort. Servants prepared food offerings. Musicians appeared on painted walls. Gardens, boats, and pleasant river scenes promised peace beyond death. Ordinary workers often received far simpler burials. A reed mat. A small grave in desert sand. A few personal belongings. Perhaps bread or pottery placed nearby by grieving relatives. Still, nearly everyone hoped for peace after death. Perhaps because earthly life demanded so much patience. As evening returned once more to the Nile Valley, Shadows stretched slowly across fields where tired farmers gathered tools for the day's end. Birds drifted low above river water glowing orange beneath the setting sun. The heat softened at last. Children carried water jars homeward. Boatmen secured ropes along wooden docks. Cooking fires flickered awake across villages. Night in Egypt brought relief. The darkness hid endless labor for a few precious hours. Cool air moved through open doorways. Families rested together while stars emerged silently overhead. In wealthier homes, servants lit oil lamps beside painted walls while musicians played soft melodies during evening meals. In poorer homes, simple bread and beer were shared quietly before sleep arrived. Yet across all levels of society, the same stillness slowly settled over the land. The same deep tiredness. The same acceptance of routine. And somewhere far beyond the villages and fields, inside cool temple halls lined with towering columns, priests moved slowly through dark chambers scented with incense and old stone. There too, life followed strict routines. Rituals occurred at precise hours. Sacred objects were cleaned carefully. Offerings were prepared exactly as tradition demanded. Temple wealth was counted and protected. Workers maintained enormous religious estates that owned land, animals, workshops, and storehouses. The temples themselves became centers of both spiritual and economic control. And so religion, government, labor, and daily survival all blended together into one quiet system that shaped nearly every moment of Egyptian life. A peaceful system. A beautiful system. But also a heavy one. For the ordinary people sleeping tonight beside the Nile, tomorrow would arrive much the same as today had. The river would continue flowing through darkness. The warm wind would carry dust softly across silent roads. And before sunrise, somewhere in the sleeping villages of ancient Egypt, another tired worker would slowly open his eyes and begin again. Before the sun appeared above the eastern horizon, the Nile already carried quiet movement across its dark surface. Long narrow boats drifted through morning mist while tired fishermen pulled wet nets from the water with slow careful hands. The river smelled of mud, reeds, fish, and cool stone. Insects hovered above the surface in soft clouds, and somewhere along the bank, hidden among tall grasses, frogs called into the fading darkness. The first light of dawn spread gently across the valley. Mud brick homes slowly emerged from shadow. Palm trees stood motionless against the pale sky. Thin smoke rose from cooking fires as villages awakened one room at a time. Inside a small house near the river, a man sat quietly beside the doorway tying worn leather straps around his sandals. His knees ached before the day had fully begun. Years of bending in the fields had left his body stiff each morning, especially during cooler months when the night air settled deep into his bones. Nearby, his wife crushed grain against a grinding stone with patient movements that required no thought anymore. The rough scraping sound filled the room steadily. Their youngest child still slept beneath a woven blanket while an older daughter carried an empty water jar outside toward the riverbank. No one spoke very much. Morning often began in silence. People were still waking slowly from restless sleep. They listened to the soft sounds of work beginning around them. Doors opening. Donkeys shifting in narrow alleys. Sandals brushing against packed earth. The same sounds had greeted the village every morning for generations. The man stepped outside into cool blue light. Already he could see neighbors gathering tools beside the fields beyond the village edge. Wooden hoes rested across shoulders. Oxen snorted quietly in the dusty road. The smell of damp soil drifted from irrigation canals cut carefully through the farmland. Water was everything in Egypt. Without constant irrigation, the rich black earth beside the Nile would dry beneath the endless desert sun. So workers spent enormous amounts of time maintaining canals, lifting water, reinforcing embankments, and clearing away mud left behind after floods. This work never truly ended. Canals collapsed. Banks cracked. Silt gathered constantly. And every failure threatened crops that entire communities depended upon. Because farming mattered so deeply, the kingdom organized agricultural life with careful attention. Officials monitored flood levels each year. Local administrators inspected harvests. Scribes tracked grain supplies stored inside government granaries. In many villages, people lived under a quiet feeling that someone important was always watching from somewhere nearby. Not in a frightening way every moment, but enough to remind them that the kingdom expected obedience. A farmer who ignored irrigation duties could damage neighboring fields. A laborer who disappeared during tax collection might bring suspicion upon his family. The system relied on cooperation, and cooperation was maintained through routine, pressure, and long habit. As sunlight spread wider across the valley, workers moved slowly into the fields. The heat had not yet arrived fully, and these early hours were often the most comfortable part of the day. Birds fluttered above rows of barley while insects hummed softly among reeds near the canals. The farmers bent low to begin their work. Some loosened soil with wooden tools. Others guided oxen carefully through narrow rows. Younger boys carried baskets filled with seed while older men inspected irrigation ditches for damage caused during the night. The work required patience more than strength. Hour after hour beneath open sky. The same bending. The same lifting. The same careful watching over water and soil. Many farmers spent nearly their entire lives within sight of the same stretch of riverbank. They knew every palm tree, every curve in the canal, every patch of stubborn earth that dried too quickly beneath the sun. Their world was small and tightly connected to the rhythms of the land. But although the fields appeared peaceful from a distance, life for ordinary farmers was often uncertain. A poor flood season could reduce harvests badly. Illness might prevent a family from working enough land. Taxes remained expected regardless of personal hardship. The kingdom depended on grain. Grain fed cities, temples, armies, and royal projects. Grain supported officials and craftsmen who performed specialized labor instead of farming. Grain was wealth itself in many ways. And so grain was carefully controlled. After harvest seasons, officials sometimes arrived to measure yields. Scribes carried writing tools and papyrus scrolls while assistants supervised weighing and counting. Farmers stood nearby waiting anxiously as records were made. A disagreement over numbers could become dangerous. Many ordinary people feared officials not because violence occurred constantly, but because officials carried authority backed by the state. Their decisions mattered. Their records became permanent. Arguing too strongly might attract unwanted attention. So most people lowered their eyes and accepted what was demanded. The system moved smoothly because resistance rarely grew large enough to interrupt it. By mid-morning, the heat began settling across the fields like a heavy blanket. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while sunlight reflected brightly from irrigation water. The earth smelled warm and damp beneath bare feet. In the distance, temple walls shimmered faintly through rising heat. Temples stood everywhere across ancient Egypt. Some were enormous complexes filled with towering columns, painted halls, sacred lakes, and storehouses overflowing with grain and goods. Others were smaller local shrines where villagers brought simple offerings of bread, flowers, or beer. But even the smallest temples carried influence. Priests oversaw rituals believed necessary to maintain harmony between humans and the gods. Sacred ceremonies followed strict schedules repeated day after day with almost no change. Offerings were prepared carefully. Incense burned inside dim sanctuaries. Statues of gods were washed, dressed, and honored each morning in silence. Religion in Egypt was deeply connected to order. The rising sun, the flooding Nile, the changing seasons. Everything seemed part of a larger rhythm established long ago by divine forces. And because the pharaoh stood at the center of this sacred order, obedience to authority became woven into spiritual life itself. Many ordinary people likely found comfort in this structure. The world made sense because everyone had a place within it. Farmers farmed. Priests prayed. Scribes recorded. Builders constructed monuments for eternity. The system felt stable, predictable, endless. Yet stability came with limits. Most workers had little freedom to change their position in life. A poor farmer rarely became wealthy. A laborer born into hard work usually remained close to that same labor until death. Children inherited not only family trades, but family burdens. A young boy watching his father in the fields could already imagine his own future clearly. The same sun, the same soil, the same aching muscles at day's end. As afternoon approached, the village streets emptied beneath the strongest heat. Dogs slept beside shaded walls. Donkeys stood motionless beneath heavy loads. Even conversations became quieter during these exhausting hours. Inside workshops, however, labor continued steadily. Egyptian towns were filled with craftsmen producing the endless supplies needed to support daily life and state projects alike. Potters shaped wet clay upon spinning wheels while sweat dripped slowly down their arms. Bakers worked beside blazing ovens where heat became almost unbearable by midday. Weavers sat before wooden looms for hours guiding linen thread through careful patterns. The sounds of workshops blended together softly. Hammering from metal workers. Grinding from stone cutters. The crackling of kiln fires. The steady brushing of reed pens inside scribal offices nearby. Every object required labor. Every piece of cloth. Every clay jar. Every fishing net. Every sandal. Ancient Egypt appeared magnificent partly because countless ordinary workers spent their entire lives producing and repairing the materials that held society together. In crowded pottery workshops, the air smelled thick with wet clay and smoke. Workers coated in pale dust lifted freshly shaped vessels toward large ovens heated by charcoal and dried reeds. The work was repetitive and exhausting. Yet pottery was needed everywhere. Water jars. Storage containers. Cooking bowls. Beer vessels. Funeral offerings. Broken pottery pieces covered the ground outside many settlements because clay objects were used constantly and replaced often. Nearby, carpenters shaped wood imported from distant lands because Egypt itself lacked large forests. Wood was valuable and carefully measured. Even simple furniture required skilled labor and precious materials. Most homes remained modest despite the great wealth displayed by temples and royal monuments. Ordinary people lived close together in narrow houses built from sun-dried mud brick. Roofs were flat. Windows remained small to reduce heat. Rooms were dark during midday but cooler than the burning streets outside. At night, families often slept upon rooftops when weather allowed. Higher air felt slightly cooler after sunset, and many people preferred the open night sky to the trapped warmth inside crowded rooms. As the afternoon slowly faded, life gradually returned outdoors. Children ran through dusty alleys chasing one another while older women sat together weaving baskets or mending clothing. The smell of bread baking drifted once again through the village. A man carrying fish from the river walked slowly toward the market while flies circled lazily around woven baskets hanging from his shoulders. Markets in Egypt could feel crowded and noisy compared to the quiet fields beyond town. Merchants traded vegetables, fish, cloth, pottery, oils, sandals, tools, and small luxury goods brought through river trade. Yet even here, life remained heavily organized. Officials monitored trade. Taxes applied to goods moving through important areas. Storehouses tracked supplies carefully. The kingdom wanted stability above all else. Large disruptions threatened food distribution, labor organization, and public order. So Egypt developed systems that encouraged routine behavior and discouraged unpredictability. For many ordinary people, this produced lives that felt both secure and restricted at the same time. There was comfort in knowing tomorrow would likely resemble today. But there was also little escape from assigned duties. As sunset approached, long shadows stretched across temple courtyards and village streets alike. Workers returned home slowly carrying tools worn smooth by years of use. Bodies moved carefully after long hours beneath the heat. Evening meals were simple for most families. Bread remained the center of daily life. Thick loaves made from coarse grain filled stomachs after exhausting workdays. Beer, cloudy and nutritious, was consumed by both adults and children because clean drinking water could not always be trusted alone. Sometimes there were onions. Sometimes lentils. Sometimes dried fish or dates. Meat was less common for ordinary people, though festivals and special occasions occasionally brought richer meals. Families gathered close together during these evening hours. Oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls while smoke drifted upward through roof openings. Some fathers told quiet stories. Some mothers continued weaving late into the evening. Children slowly fell asleep beside the warm glow of cooking fires. Outside, the night air finally cooled the village. The sounds of labor faded. No more hammers. No more shouted instructions from overseers. Only soft conversation, insects humming in darkness, and the distant steady movement of the Nile beneath the stars. But while ordinary workers rested, certain parts of Egyptian society continued through the night. Temple guards remained awake beside sacred storehouses. Scribes sometimes worked late recording deliveries or calculating accounts by oil lamp. River transport crews guided boats beneath moonlight when schedules required continued travel. The machinery of the kingdom never fully slept. Especially near royal projects. Far south along the Nile, near enormous construction sites, entire communities existed almost entirely for labor. Workers carved tombs deep into cliffs or hauled limestone blocks beneath the direction of officials responsible for maintaining strict schedules. These labor settlements were carefully controlled environments. Food rations were distributed systematically. Attendance was monitored. Medical care, though limited, was organized enough to keep workers productive whenever possible. Excavations thousands of years later would reveal detailed records describing absences from work due to illness, family matters, religious festivals, or injuries. The kingdom recorded everything. A worker absent because of eye pain. A laborer missing due to caring for a sick mother. A craftsman delayed because of brewing beer at home. Even ordinary moments entered official records. Control did not always appear harsh from the outside. Often it looked orderly. Administrative. Quiet. That quietness became one of the defining feelings of Egyptian life. Not silence exactly, but the calm rhythm of a society where most people understood the boundaries surrounding them. Inside one worker village near a royal tomb site, evening settled gently across rows of narrow homes. Dust floated through fading sunlight. Men with sore backs sat outside doorways rubbing tired hands while wives prepared bread nearby. A young boy listened carefully as his father described stone-cutting techniques learned after many years inside narrow burial chambers. The father spoke slowly, almost sleepily, while staring toward distant cliffs glowing red beneath sunset. Tomorrow would bring more labor underground. More dust. More hammering inside hot stone corridors lit only by flickering oil lamps. Yet there was also pride hidden within the exhaustion. Many workers understood they were helping create something intended to last forever. Temples. Tombs. Statues. Painted walls carrying names into eternity. The kingdom depended on this feeling too. Order became easier to maintain when labor carried spiritual meaning alongside physical necessity. As darkness deepened, stars emerged clearly over the desert. Without modern lights, the night sky above ancient Egypt appeared vast and overflowing with brilliant patterns. The Milky Way stretched like pale river mist across the heavens while cool wind moved softly over sand and stone. For a few quiet hours, the heat loosened its grip on the land. People breathed more easily. Workers slept heavily from exhaustion. Babies stirred softly beside sleeping mothers. Somewhere in the distance, musicians played gentle melodies during a wealthy household's evening gathering, though such comforts remained far removed from the lives of ordinary laborers. Still, even poor families found moments of peace at night. A cool breeze through an open doorway. The smell of fresh bread. Children sleeping safely nearby. The quiet comfort of routine. And perhaps that was part of why the system endured for so long. Life was difficult. But it was familiar. Predictable suffering can sometimes feel less frightening than uncertainty. The Nile continued flooding. The crops continued growing. The temples continued receiving offerings. The scribes continued writing. Generation after generation moved through the same slow patterns beneath the same desert stars. And so, deep into the warm Egyptian night, while reeds whispered beside dark riverbanks and distant dogs barked softly beyond sleeping villages, the great kingdom rested inside its endless rhythm of quiet control. The first sound many people heard each morning in ancient Egypt was not the voice of another person. It was the sound of work beginning. A grinding stone turning slowly in darkness. Water sloshing inside clay jars. Sandals brushing against packed earth floors. The soft cough of a tired laborer waking before sunrise. Long before the sky brightened over the Nile, movement quietly returned to the villages once again. The air felt cooler in these early hours. Desert heat still rested somewhere beyond the horizon, waiting patiently for the sun. For a brief time each morning, the world seemed softer. Even the animals moved more calmly beneath the fading stars. A woman stepped outside carrying a small oil lamp through narrow streets lined with sleeping homes. She walked carefully toward a communal oven where several neighbors were already preparing bread dough in silence. The smell of yeast and warm grain slowly filled the cool air. Nearby, a donkey shifted beneath bundles of reeds tied tightly across its back. Somewhere farther down the road, a child cried sleepily before being soothed again by a quiet voice drifting through an open doorway. Life in Egypt repeated itself so steadily that many days must have felt almost identical. The same labor. The same paths through the village. The same aches in the body at night. And always above these ordinary lives stood the larger structure of the kingdom, patient and organized like the slow movement of the Nile itself. For most people, control did not arrive dramatically. It lived inside daily routines. Inside expectations. Inside habits taught from childhood. A young boy growing up beside the river learned quickly when to wake, how to carry tools, how to respect overseers, how to avoid mistakes that could bring punishment or shame upon his family. Girls learned household labor just as early. Grinding grain, brewing beer, weaving linen, caring for younger children, fetching water from the riverbanks. By the time they became adults, these routines lived inside their muscles like memory itself. The kingdom did not need constant force to maintain order. People carried the order within them. As sunrise slowly colored the eastern sky, farmers moved toward the fields while thin mist lifted gently from irrigation canals. Palm trees cast long shadows across wet earth. Birds schemed low over the water searching for insects hidden among reeds. The Nile Valley looked peaceful in the morning light. Green fields stretched beside golden desert cliffs. White sails drifted quietly along the river. Mud-brick villages rested low against the earth as though they had grown naturally from the soil itself. Travelers arriving from harsher lands may have seen Egypt as calm and prosperous. And in many ways, it truly was. Compared to regions plagued by constant invasion or unpredictable weather, Egypt often enjoyed remarkable stability during its strongest periods. The Nile's regular floods created dependable agriculture. Food supplies could be stored. Trade routes remained active. Governments lasted for generations. But stability required enormous organization behind the scenes. Especially in agriculture. The flooding Nile gave life, but floodwaters also needed management. Irrigation systems demanded labor from entire communities. Canals had to be maintained carefully or crops would fail. Every year, as floodwaters receded, workers spread across the fields repairing damage left behind by the river. Men shoveled mud beneath the rising heat while overseers inspected progress carefully. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Feet sank into soft black soil. Mosquitoes drifted above standing water. The work was exhausting long before midday arrived. And because these projects mattered to everyone's survival, participation was often expected rather than optional. The kingdom could call upon labor from villages when large public work became necessary. Sometimes this involved farming infrastructure. Other times it meant transporting stone, constructing temples, repairing roads, or supporting royal building campaigns. For ordinary people, life could shift suddenly from local village labor to state-controlled work far from home. A farmer might spend months away helping move limestone blocks or digging canals under official supervision. Food rations would be distributed. Sleeping areas assigned. Attendance recorded. Even far from home, the system followed him. At large labor sites, mornings began before dawn. Workers gathered beneath torchlight while foremen counted crews carefully. Some men carried wooden mallets and copper chisels. Others prepared ropes, sledges, or baskets for hauling rubble. Voices stayed low in the darkness. Most workers were still half asleep. The air smelled of sweat, dust, lamp oil, and damp stone. Then, slowly, labor began again. Inside tomb corridors carved deep into desert cliffs, stonecutters worked beneath flickering oil lamps that painted weak yellow light across rough walls. The air inside these chambers often felt thick and hot despite the coolness of surrounding rock. Dust floated constantly through narrow spaces. Hammer strikes echoed softly through unfinished passages. Workers paused frequently to wipe sweat from their eyes and drink small amounts of water carried carefully underground. Some men spent years inside these hidden chambers preparing burial places they themselves would never enter after death. Artists followed behind the stonecutters. Painters mixed pigments carefully in small bowls while sketching scenes of eternal life upon smooth plaster walls. They painted gardens, riverboats, musicians, servants carrying food offerings, birds rising from marshes beside the Nile. The tomb walls showed peaceful worlds. Quiet worlds. Worlds where noble families rested forever in comfort and abundance. Yet outside those painted chambers, the craftsmen themselves often returned each evening to cramped homes filled with heat, fatigue, and simple meals. Still, many workers likely took pride in skilled craftsmanship. Egyptian artisans developed extraordinary abilities through long practice. Stone carving, painting, metalworking, woodworking, and jewelry making required patience learned over many years. A master craftsman might train apprentices slowly, correcting mistakes with calm repetition day after day. Again and again. The same motions. The same careful techniques. The same discipline. In this way, control also existed through knowledge passed between generations. People learned not only how to work, but how to behave. How to remain patient. How to accept hierarchy. How to endure repetition quietly. By midday, the heat across Egypt became difficult to escape. Sunlight reflected fiercely from pale stone walls and dry ground. Air shimmered above roads stretching through open desert. Even inside shaded workshops, sweat gathered constantly along workers' arms and faces. Those who labored outdoors suffered most heavily. Boat crews hauling against river currents strained beneath burning sunlight while ropes cut into their hands. Quarry workers chipped stone from cliffs where heat radiated from the rock itself. Farmers bent over fields while insects crawled endlessly through thick vegetation near irrigation canals. Water carriers moved slowly through work sites delivering clay jars filled from the Nile. A drink of cool river water could feel like relief from another world. But rest remained limited. Schedules mattered. Deliveries mattered. Construction timelines mattered. And always someone nearby carried authority to enforce those expectations. Foremen. Overseers. Officials. Scribes. Egyptian society functioned through layers of supervision that reached into nearly every type of labor. The workers understood this clearly. A missing tool might be recorded. An unfinished task noticed. A delayed shipment investigated. Sometimes punishments were physical. Other times they involved reduced rations, public humiliation, or reassignment to harsher duties. The threat itself often maintained discipline without needing constant violence. Most people simply wanted to avoid trouble. And so the kingdom continued running with quiet efficiency. In larger cities, life moved with slightly different rhythms than the villages along the Nile. Streets grew more crowded. Markets expanded. Government buildings, temples, workshops, and storage houses filled entire districts with constant activity. Yet even cities carried the same feeling of order beneath their busy surfaces. Messengers moved between offices carrying records written upon papyrus scrolls. Tax officials inspected deliveries arriving by boat. Temple administrators monitored supplies flowing into sacred storehouses. Everywhere, people counted, measured, recorded. Egypt depended deeply upon administration. Without careful organization, grain could not feed growing populations. Labor forces could not support monumental construction. Trade networks could not function smoothly across long distances. The quiet power of scribes reached into all these systems. Inside shaded offices protected from the worst heat, scribes sat cross-legged before low desks while brushes moved steadily across papyrus sheets. Their fingers became stained dark with ink. Their shoulders stiffened from long hours of writing. Many scribes began training as boys. Education required discipline and repetition much like physical labor. Students copied symbols endlessly while teachers corrected mistakes sharply. Memorization filled long days inside schoolrooms attached to temples or government buildings. For families able to place sons into scribal training, this path offered escape from the hardest physical work. A famous Egyptian saying warned students that the lives of laborers were filled with misery while the scribe enjoyed comfort and respect. Yet scribal life was not luxurious for everyone. Long hours of concentration exhausted the mind just as farming exhausted the body. Records had to remain accurate. Mistakes could create serious problems. Officials above them demanded precision. Even educated workers lived inside systems of pressure and responsibility. Outside the offices, the afternoon heat slowly softened toward evening. Marketplaces became crowded again. Women carrying baskets of vegetables walked carefully through dusty streets. Fishermen cleaned their catches beside shaded stalls while cats waited nearby hoping for scraps. The smell of baked bread drifted from ovens still glowing with heat. Children played games in narrow alleys between mud brick walls. For a few hours each evening, ordinary life relaxed slightly. Workers returning home washed dust from their bodies using water poured slowly from clay jars. Families gathered together for meals while fading sunlight painted rooftops gold and orange. These small moments mattered deeply. Because life was hard. Bodies wore down early in ancient Egypt. Years of physical labor damaged joints and backs. Teeth often suffered badly from coarse bread filled with tiny particles of stone left behind during grain grinding. Illness spread easily in crowded settlements. Infections. Parasites. Eye diseases caused by dust and sunlight. Fevers carried by insects near standing water. Medical knowledge existed and Egyptian healers developed treatments using herbs, oils, bandages, and practical experience. Some remedies helped. Others likely did little at all. For ordinary workers, sickness could become frightening not only because of pain, but because labor still needed completion. A family depended upon every able body. When one person weakened, burdens shifted heavily onto others. Yet despite exhaustion and hardship, people still found quiet forms of happiness woven into daily life. A cool evening breeze after brutal heat. Music drifting softly through a courtyard. Fresh bread shared among family members. Children laughing beside the riverbank. Ancient Egyptian life was not constant suffering. But it was deeply controlled by structures larger than any individual. Even time itself felt organized. The flooding season. The planting season. The harvest season. Religious festivals marking sacred days throughout the year. Everything moved according to rhythms established long before any single person was born. This predictability shaped emotional life as much as physical labor did. Many people likely accepted their place because imagining a different kind of world felt almost impossible. The kingdom had always existed. The Nile had always flooded. The temples had always stood beside the river. Night slowly returned once again over Egypt. Oil lamps flickered inside homes while darkness gathered softly across the fields. The day's final heat drifted upward from stone roads and mud brick walls. Some workers climbed onto rooftops to sleep beneath open skies. Others remained awake briefly sharing quiet conversation before exhaustion finally pulled them toward rest. Far away, deep inside temple sanctuaries, priests continued evening rituals beneath towering columns painted with stars and sacred symbols. Incense smoke curled slowly upward through dim chambers while chants echoed softly against ancient stone. Even here, at the heart of religion itself, routines never changed carelessly. Every movement followed tradition. Every object placed precisely. Order brought comfort. Order brought stability. and stability allowed Egypt to endure century after century beside the patient flowing Nile. Beyond the temples and villages, desert winds moved quietly across empty sands beneath moonlight. Tomb entrances rested sealed within silent cliffs. Boats rocked gently along dark riverbanks. The kingdom slept. But only lightly. Because before long, somewhere in the darkness, another grinding stone would begin turning once again. Another laborer would rise before dawn. Another scribe would prepare fresh ink beside waiting scrolls. And ancient Egypt, calm and controlled beneath the stars, would continue into another slow and weary day. The night in ancient Egypt did not feel empty. It felt lived in. Even in the deepest hours of darkness, the land carried a soft sense of presence. The Nile kept moving quietly, as it always did, touching both banks with slow patient water. Reeds shifted gently in the breeze. Small animals moved through fields that had been silent only moments before. And somewhere in that darkness, life continued in smaller, quieter ways. A fisherman checked his nets beneath moonlight. A guard walked slowly along the outer wall of a temple complex. A baker stirred embers in an oven that never fully cooled. And in villages along the river, families slept while their bodies recovered from another long day of labor that would soon return again. The rhythm never truly stopped. It only changed shape. In the earliest hours before dawn, when the sky was still heavy with stars, Egypt felt almost weightless. The heat had not yet returned. The sun had not yet claimed the land. For a short time, everything belonged to stillness. But even stillness in Egypt had structure. Watchmen followed routes they knew by memory, pacing the same stone paths each night. Their sandals touched the ground in steady intervals. Their eyes adjusted to darkness that was never complete, shaped by starlight and the pale reflection of river water nearby. These guards were not wandering freely. They were following expectation. Even the night had rules. Inside temple compounds, sacred spaces remained protected by layers of quiet authority. Storehouses held grain, incense, oils, linen, and offerings meant for rituals that would resume with sunrise. Doors were sealed carefully. Seals were checked. Records were maintained. The gods, too, were part of this system of order. Egyptian belief held that divine forces required constant attention. Rituals were not optional. They were necessary maintenance of the world itself. Without them, chaos might slowly creep into existence, like dust settling into corners of a room left unattended. So even while most people slept, priests ensured that balance was preserved. Oil lamps burned in dim chambers where statues of gods stood silently within carved shrines. These statues were treated as living presences. They were washed, dressed, and given offerings as if they were part of daily life. The work was calm and precise. Water poured carefully from clay vessels. Cloth wrapped gently around carved stone forms. Incense drifted upward in thin streams that disappeared into darkness above. Everything moved slowly. Everything followed tradition. Outside the temples, the villages remained quiet, though not completely still. A baby stirred briefly before settling again. A dog shifted position near a doorway. Wind passed through narrow streets carrying the faint scent of dust and distant fields. Inside a small home near the river, a family slept on woven mats placed close together for warmth and comfort. The walls around them were thick with dried mud, holding the heat of the day and slowly releasing it into the cooler night air. Above them, the roof was flat and open to the sky. Stars shone through the darkness like scattered points of light placed carefully across the heavens. In many households, these rooftops became sleeping spaces during certain seasons. Families carried mats upward in the evening and lay beneath open sky, listening to the sounds of night drifting across the valley. Crickets. Faint water movement. Occasional footsteps far away. And the steady silence that always returned between them. Even sleep in ancient Egypt existed within the rhythm of labor. Bodies needed rest to continue work. Rest was not freedom from the system. It was part of it. The kingdom understood that exhausted workers could not sustain long-term production, so rest became a natural, accepted part of life rather than something separate from duty. And so people slept. Deeply. Often heavily. Their bodies shaped by long days of physical effort, their minds quieted by repetition of routine. When dawn approached again, the change was subtle at first. A faint shift in color along the horizon. A thin line of light forming above desert cliffs. Birds beginning to move before full awareness returned to the land. Then the sound of life slowly rising once more. A door opening. A water jar lifted. A grinding stone placed into position. The beginning of another day. In larger towns, officials sometimes began their work even earlier than farmers. Administrative life did not depend on sunlight as strictly as agriculture did. Inside dim offices lit by oil lamps, scribes reviewed records from the previous day. Their hands moved carefully across papyrus sheets. Ink dried slowly in warm air. Lists were checked again and again. Names. Amounts. Deliveries. Taxes. Work assignments. Everything had to match expectations. Accuracy mattered deeply in a society that relied so heavily on written order. A small error in a number could affect entire storehouses of grain. A missing record could create confusion during distribution. A miswritten name could delay a worker's ration. So scribes worked with quiet intensity. Not loud intensity. Not hurried panic. But steady, careful attention that stretched across long hours. Their lives were often more comfortable than those of farmers or laborers, yet they were not free from pressure. Responsibility existed in its own form. The weight of accuracy could feel just as heavy as physical labor, only in a different way. Outside the offices, early morning streets began filling once again. Merchants opened wooden shutters. Bakers prepared ovens. Water carriers moved toward the river. Donkeys were loaded with goods for transport along narrow roads. The smell of early bread drifted through cool air. Smoke rose from cooking fires scattered across rooftops. The city awakened slowly, layer by layer. In farming villages along the Nile, irrigation work resumed almost immediately. Water channels needed constant attention, especially after changes in flood levels or sediment buildup. Farmers checked embankments for damage. They cleared debris. They guided water carefully toward fields that depended on precise distribution. A single mistake in irrigation could dry out a section of land or flood another too heavily. So attention mattered. Patience mattered. Repetition mattered. And beneath it all, the understanding that the river itself could not be controlled fully, only guided and maintained. The Nile remained the central force of Egyptian life. Its yearly flooding shaped everything. When waters rose gently and predictably, harvests were abundant. When floods were weak or irregular, hardship followed. Entire communities depended on this cycle. Because of this dependence, people watched the river closely. Officials measured water levels using markers placed along riverbanks. Priests interpreted signs and performed rituals asking for balanced flooding. Farmers observed subtle changes in current and color that might signal coming shifts in the season. The river was both provider and risk. Gift and uncertainty together. And yet it was also familiar, almost like a living companion that returned each year with expected rhythm. As the sun climbed higher, warmth returned gradually across the valley. Morning coolness faded. Work intensified. Fields became active once again with bending bodies and slow steady movement. Oxen pulled wooden plows through soil. Workers repaired canals. Children carried tools between adults working in different sections of farmland. In construction areas, teams organized themselves under supervision. Stone blocks were inspected before being moved. Ropes were tested. Teams coordinated their movements carefully to avoid damage or injury. Even large-scale labor in Egypt relied heavily on coordination rather than chaos. Each movement had purpose. Each task had direction. The system functioned best when everyone understood their role clearly. And most people did. By habit. By instruction. By long familiarity. Far from the fields, inside workshop districts, craftspeople continued shaping the material goods that supported daily life. The sound of carving wood echoed softly from shaded interiors. Metal workers hammered copper and bronze into tools and ornaments. Potters rotated clay vessels slowly while shaping them with practiced hands. The smell of heat, smoke, and earth filled these spaces. Time passed differently inside workshops. Less tied to the sun. More tied to completion of objects. A pot was finished when it was fired. A tool was finished when it was sharpened. A cloth was finished when it was woven. Work did not end at a fixed hour. It ended when the task was complete. This created its own rhythm of fatigue and satisfaction. But always, there would be more tasks waiting. More objects needed. More repairs required. More replacements for items broken through constant use. Egyptian life relied heavily on repair and continuation rather than replacement or change. Structures were maintained for long periods. Tools were reused. Objects were repaired repeatedly. Nothing was expected to last forever except the great monuments and the order of society itself. As afternoon heat deepened, movement across the land slowed slightly once again. Workers paused in shade when possible. Water was shared carefully. Conversations became quieter. Even animals seemed less active under the weight of sun. Inside homes, small acts of life continued steadily. Cooking. Weaving. Cleaning. Caring for children. Resting briefly between tasks. The domestic world formed a constant background layer of labor that rarely stopped entirely. Even when larger field work paused, household work continued. This invisible labor held society together in ways that were often unrecorded but deeply essential. As evening approached again, the light across Egypt shifted into warm gold tones. The Nile reflected the sky like a slow-moving mirror. Boats returned along familiar routes. Villages prepared for the end of another cycle of labor. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires. And once again, the day softened into night. Not as an ending, but as a pause before repetition. People returned home with tired bodies and quiet thoughts. Tools were placed aside. Shoes removed. Hands washed of dust and soil. Families gathered again in dim light. Bread broken. Water shared. Simple words spoken between long silences. And as sleep returned across the valley once more, the kingdom continued to exist in the background of everything. Measured. Recorded. Maintained. A world built on rhythm rather than change. A world where each day resembled the one before it, like footprints pressed repeatedly into the same path along the riverbank. And somewhere beyond the villages, beyond the fields, beyond the dim glow of oil lamps fading into night, the Nile kept flowing through darkness with quiet patience, carrying Egypt forward into another calm and controlled morning that had not yet arrived. The night settled again over the Nile with a familiar softness, as if the land itself exhaled after a long day of movement. Darkness in ancient Egypt was never truly silent. It carried its own quiet texture. The faint ripple of water against riverbanks, the distant call of an owl, the slow rustle of reeds bending in the warm breeze that drifted in from the desert. But beneath all of it, there was still a deep and steady calm. A calm that came from repetition, from certainty, from lives that followed paths already drawn, onal footsteps far away, and the steady silence that always returned between them. Even sleep in ancient Egypt existed within the rhythm of labor. Bodies needed rest to continue work. Rest was not freedom from the system. It was part of it. The kingdom understood that exhausted workers could not sustain long-term production, so rest became a natural, accepted part of life rather than something separate from duty. And so people slept. Deeply. Often heavily. Their bodies shaped by long days of physical effort, their minds quieted by repetition of routine. When dawn approached again, the change was subtle at first. A faint shift in color along the horizon. A thin line of light forming above desert cliffs. Birds beginning to move before full awareness returned to the land. Then the sound of life slowly rising once more. A door opening. A water jar lifted. A grinding stone placed into position. The beginning of another day. In larger towns, officials sometimes began their work even earlier than farmers. Administrative life did not depend on sunlight as strictly as agriculture did. Inside dim offices lit by oil lamps, scribes reviewed records from the previous day. Their hands moved carefully across papyrus sheets. Ink dried slowly in warm air. Lists were checked again and again. Names. Amounts. Deliveries. Taxes. Work assignments. Everything had to match expectations. Accuracy mattered deeply in a society that relied so heavily on written order. A small error in a number could affect entire storehouses of grain. A missing record could create confusion during distribution. A miswritten name could delay a worker's ration. So scribes worked with quiet intensity. Not loud intensity. Not hurried panic. But steady, careful attention that stretched across long hours. Their lives were often more comfortable than those of farmers or laborers, yet they were not free from pressure. Responsibility existed in its own form. The weight of accuracy could feel just as heavy as physical labor, only in a different way. Outside the offices, early morning streets began filling once again. Merchants opened wooden shutters. Bakers prepared ovens. Water carriers moved toward the river. Donkeys were loaded with goods for transport along narrow roads. The smell of early bread drifted through cool air. Smoke rose from cooking fires scattered across rooftops. The city awakened slowly, layer by layer. In farming villages along the Nile, irrigation work resumed almost immediately. Water channels needed constant attention, especially after changes in flood levels or sediment buildup. Farmers checked embankments for damage. They cleared debris. They guided water carefully toward fields that depended on precise distribution. A single mistake in irrigation could dry out a section of land or flood another too heavily. So attention mattered. Patience mattered. Repetition mattered. And beneath it all, the understanding that the river itself could not be controlled fully, only guided and maintained. The Nile remained the central force of Egyptian life. Its yearly flooding shaped everything. When waters rose gently and predictably, harvests were abundant. When floods were weak or irregular, hardship followed. Entire communities depended on this cycle. Because of this dependence, people watched the river closely. Officials measured water levels using markers placed along riverbanks. Priests interpreted signs and performed rituals asking for balanced flooding. Farmers observed subtle changes in current and color that might signal coming shifts in the season. The river was both provider and risk, gift and uncertainty together. And yet it was also familiar, almost like a living companion that returned each year with expected rhythm. As the sun climbed higher, warmth returned gradually across the valley. Morning coolness faded. Work intensified. Fields became active once again with bending bodies and slow steady movement. Oxen pulled wooden plows through soil. Workers repaired canals. Children carried tools between adults working in different sections of farmland. In construction areas, teams organized themselves under supervision. Stone blocks were inspected before being moved. Ropes were tested. Teams coordinated their movements carefully to avoid damage or injury. Even large-scale labor in Egypt relied heavily on coordination rather than chaos. Each movement had purpose. Each task had direction. The system functioned best when everyone understood their role clearly. And most people did. By habit. By instruction. By long familiarity. Far from the fields, inside workshop districts, craftspeople continued shaping the material goods that supported daily life. The sound of carving wood echoed softly from shaded interiors. Metal workers hammered copper and bronze into tools and ornaments. Potters rotated clay vessels slowly while shaping them with practiced hands. The smell of heat, smoke, and earth filled these spaces. Time passed differently inside workshops. Less tied to the sun. More tied to completion of objects. A pot was finished when it was fired. A tool was finished when it was sharpened. A cloth was finished when it was woven. Work did not end at a fixed hour. It ended when the task was complete. This created its own rhythm of fatigue and satisfaction. But always, there would be more tasks waiting. More objects needed. More repairs required. More replacements for items broken through constant use. Egyptian life relied heavily on repair and continuation rather than replacement or change. Structures were maintained for long periods. Tools were reused. Objects were repaired repeatedly. Nothing was expected to last forever except the great monuments and the order of society itself. As afternoon heat deepened, movement across the land slowed slightly once again. Workers paused in shade when possible. Water was shared carefully. Conversations became quieter. Even animals seemed less active under the weight of sun. Inside homes, small acts of life continued steadily. Cooking. Weaving. Cleaning. Caring for children. Resting briefly between tasks. The domestic world formed a constant background layer of labor that rarely stopped entirely. Even when larger field work paused, household work continued. This invisible labor held society together in ways that were often unrecorded but deeply essential. As evening approached again, the light across Egypt shifted into warm gold tones. The Nile reflected the sky like a slow-moving mirror. Boats returned along familiar routes. Villages prepared for the end of another cycle of labor. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires. And once again, the day softened into night. Not as an ending, but as a pause before repetition. People returned home with tired bodies and quiet thoughts. Tools were placed aside. Shoes removed. Hands washed of dust and soil. Families gathered again in dim light. bread broken, water shared. Simple words spoken between long silences. And as sleep returned across the valley once more, the kingdom continued to exist in the background of everything. Measured, recorded, maintained. A world built on rhythm rather than change. A world where each day resembled the one before it, like footprints pressed repeatedly into the same path along the riverbank. And somewhere beyond the villages, beyond the fields, beyond the dim glow of oil lamps fading into night, the Nile kept flowing through darkness with quiet patience, carrying Egypt forward into another calm and controlled morning that had not yet arrived. The night settled again over the Nile with a familiar softness, as if the land itself exhaled after a long day of movement. Darkness in ancient Egypt was never truly silent. It carried its own quiet texture. The faint ripple of water against riverbanks. The distant call of an owl. The slow rustle of reeds bending in the warm breeze that drifted in from the desert. But beneath all of it, there was still a deep and steady calm. A calm that came from repetition. From certainty. From lives that followed paths already drawn long before anyone was born. Inside small villages, people slept in different positions of comfort and fatigue, but their rest was shaped by the same shared exhaustion. Farmers who had spent the day under the sun slept deeply, their breathing slow and heavy. Weavers with sore fingers rested with arms still faintly tense. Children curled close to parents for warmth and safety. The body remembered work even in sleep. And sleep became part of preparation for the next day. In some homes, oil lamps still flickered weakly as late conversations faded. A father might sit quietly for a moment longer, staring at the dim glow against mud brick walls. A mother might adjust a child's blanket with slow, careful hands before lying down herself. Outside, the village gradually dissolved into stillness. Only the river remained in motion. Always the river. The Nile carried time in a way people could feel but not control. It did not rush. It did not stop. It simply continued, season after season, flood after flood, year after year, shaping everything along its edges. To the people living beside it, the river was not just geography. It was the background of existence. The reason fields existed. The reason villages existed. The reason the kingdom itself could endure in such a harsh desert landscape. And because everything depended on it, everything also depended on keeping order around it. In the early hours before dawn, small groups of workers sometimes moved along riverbanks even while most of the land slept. These were not loud movements. They were careful, habitual tasks that fit into the rhythm of daily maintenance. Inspecting boats tied to wooden posts. Checking nets left to dry. Repairing ropes before morning use. Pouring water over baked clay storage jars to prevent cracking in the heat. Even in rest, there was preparation. Even in silence, there was structure. Far inland, in temple districts where stone walls held cooler air, night guards walked slow routes through courtyards lined with statues and columns. Their footsteps echoed gently across stone floors worn smooth by centuries of passing movement. They were not hurried. There was no need for urgency. Everything was already arranged. Their task was simply to ensure nothing disrupted the arrangement. Occasionally, one guard would pause beneath a carved wall and look upward at figures of gods and pharaohs depicted in eternal scenes. The images were calm, idealized, and unchanging. Kings offering gifts. Gods receiving them. Symbols of order repeating endlessly across painted stone. These images reinforced a feeling shared across society. That stability was sacred. That change was something to be managed carefully. That the world functioned best when everything remained in its place. As night deepened further, the temperature across Egypt softened. Heat released slowly from stone and soil, drifting upward into cooler air. People who slept on rooftops shifted slightly as breeze passed over them. In enclosed homes, the thick mud walls held warmth longer, creating gentle comfort through the night. Somewhere near the river, a boatman remained awake for a final moment, watching the dark water reflect scattered starlight. His hands rested on the wooden edge of the boat. He might have been waiting for a signal, or simply preparing for an early departure before sunrise. Even those who worked at night were part of the same cycle. Work and rest interwoven without sharp boundaries. In Egypt, time did not feel divided into extremes. It flowed like the river. And before dawn returned, the world began its slow transition again. The first sign was always subtle. A faint lightening of the eastern sky. A slight change in the sound of insects. The soft shifting of animals becoming more active as darkness weakened. In one village, a woman rose quietly and stepped outside with a clay jar. The ground beneath her feet was cool. The air felt different, lighter, as if the world had not yet decided whether it wanted to remain in night or begin the day. She walked toward the river. Other figures were already moving faintly in the distance. Not many. Just enough to suggest that life was returning. At the water's edge, she filled her jar carefully. The surface of the Nile was smooth, almost mirror-like in the early light. Her reflection appeared briefly before ripples disturbed it. She paused for a moment. Not thinking anything specific. Just existing in the stillness between night and morning. Then she turned back toward home. Behind her, the river continued flowing without interruption. When the sun finally rose, it did so slowly, without force. Light spread across fields, villages, temples, and desert edges alike. Shadows shortened. Colors returned to the world. Warmth began building once again. And as it always did, the kingdom awakened. Inside homes, families began their routines. Grinding grain. Heating ovens. Preparing tools. Washing sleep from faces with cool water carried from the river. In the fields, farmers prepared for another long stretch of labor under rising heat. Oxen were harnessed. Irrigation channels inspected. Seed stored from previous harvests was readied for use. Along river routes, boats began to move again, sails catching early wind as they carried goods toward distant towns. The rhythm resumed without hesitation. As though it had never paused at all. In administrative buildings, scribes returned to their desks. The scent of ink and papyrus filled enclosed rooms. Records from the previous day were reviewed again, adjusted if needed, and stored carefully for future reference. Numbers had to remain stable. Orders had to remain clear. Nothing could be left uncertain. In temple courtyards, priests began morning rituals that marked the official start of daily order. Statues were washed with careful hands. Offerings of bread and incense were prepared. Sacred words were spoken in quiet repetition that echoed through stone halls. Everything followed sequence. Everything followed tradition. The sun itself seemed to confirm the system by rising predictably each day, reinforcing the sense that the world was built on reliable patterns. For ordinary people, this predictability shaped thought as much as action. There was little need to imagine sudden change. Life unfolded in familiar stages. Childhood. Work. Family. Aging. Rest. And the same cycle repeated in the next generation. A boy watching his father lift tools in the morning would one day perform the same motion himself. A girl watching her mother prepare bread would one day follow the same routine. not because they were forced in every moment, but because the structure of life made it the natural path forward. By mid-morning, sunlight grew stronger again over the Nile Valley. Heat returned to stone paths and open fields. Shadows became short and sharp. The air began to shimmer faintly above roads stretching into desert distance. Work intensified as the day progressed. Yet even within intensity, there was calm repetition. Dig. Carry. Measure. Record. Weave. Shape. Transport. Every action part of a larger system that rarely changed in its design. And above it all, unseen but always present, was the understanding that everything had its place. As afternoon slowly approached, the rhythm of the day leaned once more toward fatigue. Bodies began to slow. Movement became heavier. Rest in shaded areas became more frequent where possible. And still, life continued. Because it always had. Because it always would, as far as anyone could imagine. The Nile flowed on. The sun completed its arc across the sky. The kingdom maintained its order through countless small acts repeated without end. And in the quiet spaces between labor and rest, between night and morning, between effort and stillness, ancient Egypt remained what it had always been. A world of steady movement. Soft control. An endless, familiar rhythm beneath the desert sky. As evening drifted slowly across the Nile Valley once again, the heat began loosening its hold on the land. The light softened first. Bright gold faded into deeper amber tones that stretched across the fields and reflected gently from the river. Palm trees cast long shadows over dusty roads where workers returned home in silence or quiet conversation. The sky above Egypt widened into layers of pale orange, fading blue, and distant violet. For many people, this was the most peaceful hour of the day. The labor was ending. The air became easier to breathe. And for a short while, before darkness fully arrived, the kingdom seemed to slow its endless motion. Along the riverbanks, fishermen untangled their nets while standing ankle-deep in cooling mud. Small boats rocked gently against wooden posts driven into the shore. Water birds moved through reeds with delicate steps, barely disturbing the quiet surface around them. The Nile carried the smell of wet earth and river plants. A familiar smell. A smell tied to survival itself. Nearby, women washed cooking bowls and cloth in shallow water while children played close to the shore, their feet splashing softly in the fading light. Their laughter drifted briefly through the evening air before disappearing into the larger calm surrounding the village. No one hurried now. The hardest part of the day had passed. In the fields beyond the homes, farmers gathered tools worn smooth by years of use. Wooden handles darkened by sweat rested across tired shoulders. Oxen were guided slowly toward fenced areas where they could rest through the night. The earth still held warmth beneath bare feet. Dust clung to ankles and clothing. Bodies ached in familiar ways. Yet there was comfort in returning home at the end of the day, even when home was simple. Especially when home was simple. Inside mud brick houses, cooking fires slowly brightened the darkening rooms. The smell of bread baking rose once again through narrow streets lined with low walls and reed mats hung outside to dry. One family sat together on the floor around a shallow clay bowl filled with lentils and onions. A loaf of coarse bread rested nearby, still warm from the oven. The father ate slowly, exhaustion visible in the way he moved his hands. His youngest child leaned sleepily against his shoulder while the mother quietly divided food into careful portions. Meals in ordinary homes were often quiet. Not unhappy. Just tired. People saved their energy because tomorrow required more labor. The body learned to conserve strength wherever possible. Outside, evening deepened. The first stars began appearing over the desert. In wealthier districts of larger towns, lamps illuminated spacious homes decorated with painted walls and carved furniture. Servants moved quietly between rooms carrying trays of food or jars of wine. Musicians played soft melodies in shaded courtyards cooled by pools of water and evening breeze. But even in these homes of comfort, life remained shaped by structure and expectation. Servants followed routines carefully. Administrators managed households with detailed oversight. Schedules guided religious rituals, social duties, and political obligations. The entire society rested upon systems of organization layered one upon another. And beneath those layers, ordinary labor supported everything. The baker waking before dawn. The fisherman repairing nets. The farmer tending canals. The scribe recording grain supplies. Without them, the great temples and monuments could not exist. As darkness spread fully across the land, the villages became quieter still. Oil lamps flickered behind small windows. Smoke drifted slowly upward into warm night air. Dogs curled beside doorways. The sounds of evening blended together softly. Low conversation. Crickets hidden among reeds. Distant water moving along the riverbank. Ancient Egypt often appeared calm because daily life followed such predictable rhythms. Most people knew where they belonged within the larger system. Their duties were understood. Their routines repeated with little variation across months and years. This predictability created stability. But it also created limits. A farmer rarely escaped farming. A servant rarely escaped service. Even skilled craftsmen, respected for their abilities, remained tied to systems larger than themselves. Control in Egypt was not always loud. Often it was simply built into daily existence so completely that few imagined living outside it. Children learned obedience naturally because every adult around them followed established patterns. They watched parents bow respectfully before officials. They observed careful behavior during religious ceremonies. They saw how records, taxes, and labor obligations shaped family life. Slowly, they absorbed the same understanding. The kingdom existed above the individual. Order mattered more than personal desire. Harmony mattered more than freedom. And so the cycle continued generation after generation beside the Nile. Late in the evening, after meals had ended and lamps burned lower, some families climbed onto rooftops to escape lingering heat trapped inside their homes. Mats were unrolled carefully across flat roofs while cool wind moved gently through the darkness. Children pointed sleepily toward stars overhead. Older relatives spoke quietly about floods from years past, harvests remembered fondly, or distant relatives living farther upriver. The stars above Egypt appeared endless without modern lights to soften them. Entire rivers of pale light stretched across the sky. Constellations rose slowly over temple walls and sleeping fields. To many Egyptians, the heavens reflected divine order just as clearly as the kingdom below. The movement of stars, the rising of the sun, the flooding Nile all seemed connected within one enormous pattern that guided existence itself. This belief gave comfort to many people. If life was difficult, at least it was meaningful. If labor was exhausting, at least it supported balance within the world. And perhaps this helped ordinary workers endure hardships that might otherwise have felt unbearable. Not all suffering can be removed. Sometimes it is simply woven quietly into daily life until it becomes familiar. Far from the villages, along desert cliffs where royal tombs were carved into stone, workers' settlements settled into silence as well. Earlier in the day, the sound of hammering had echoed endlessly across the rock faces. Now only wind moved there. Inside narrow homes built for labor crews, men slept heavily after long hours underground carving burial chambers by lamplight. Their lungs carried fine dust from stone corridors. Their hands remained sore even during sleep. Yet tomorrow they would return again. Because work schedules demanded progress. Because supervisors expected completion. Because the machinery of the kingdom never fully stopped moving. Even death required enormous labor in ancient Egypt. Royal burials consumed years of planning, construction, decoration, and preparation. Tomb walls needed carving and painting. Sarcophagi had to be shaped from massive stone blocks. Grave goods were produced by craftsmen working countless hours in workshops. And behind every beautiful object placed within a royal tomb stood ordinary workers whose names history rarely remembered. A man polishing gold late into the night. A woman weaving fine linen for burial wrappings. A carpenter smoothing wood for ceremonial furniture. A porter carrying supplies through desert heat. The splendor of the elite rested quietly upon endless layers of unseen labor. And yet many ordinary Egyptians accepted this structure as natural. Not because life was easy, but because the system had existed longer than memory itself. People were born into it the way they were born beside the river or beneath the desert sky. It simply was. As midnight approached, Egypt became deeply still once more. The temples quieted after evening rituals. Marketplaces emptied completely. Cooking fires faded into glowing embers. Only occasional movement remained along the Nile where night fishermen checked traps beneath moonlight or transport crews guided boats carefully through dark water. The moon reflected softly across the river's surface. Reeds whispered in the breeze. Somewhere in the darkness, an old farmer turned in his sleep as aching joints reminded him of decades spent working the fields. Nearby, his grandson slept soundly beside him, still too young to understand how much labor the future would ask from him. But the kingdom already had a place waiting. A role. A routine. A path worn smooth by countless feet before his own. And so, while stars drifted slowly overhead and cool wind moved through silent palms along the riverbank, ancient Egypt rested once again inside its endless balance of peace and control. A world where nearly every life followed familiar rhythms. Where every morning arrived with beauties already waiting. And where the Nile flowed patiently onward through darkness, carrying the quiet kingdom gently toward another day. Before dawn, the world along the Nile existed in a strange and gentle stillness. The sky above Egypt was dark blue now instead of black, and the stars nearest the horizon had already begun to fade. Cool air rested over the fields like a thin blanket. The desert beyond the fertile valley looked soft and distant in the half-light, its harshness hidden for a little while longer. This quiet hour belonged mostly to workers. Not officials. Not priests. Not wealthy landowners sleeping comfortably behind painted walls. It belonged to the people who rose before sunrise because the day demanded so much from them. In one riverside village, a young man stepped outside carrying a wooden yoke balanced across his shoulders. Two empty water jars hung from either side, gently knocking against his legs as he walked toward the Nile. His feet already knew the path in darkness. The ground beneath him was packed smooth from years of use. Other villagers had walked this same route thousands of times before him. Mothers carrying laundry. Children fetching water. Fishermen dragging nets before dawn. The village itself still slept quietly behind him. A few cooking fires glowed faintly. A dog lifted its head briefly before settling again. The river smelled cool and alive in the morning air. When he reached the water, the young man knelt carefully and lowered the jars beneath the surface. Small ripples spread outward beneath pale starlight. He worked slowly, still waking fully from sleep, listening to the distant sounds beginning to rise across the valley. Already, somewhere farther upstream, another village had begun its morning grinding. Stone against grain. A low rough scraping sound. Steady. Patient. Endless. Across Egypt, thousands of homes awakened in nearly the same way each day. Women bent over grinding stones before sunrise while children rubbed sleep from their eyes nearby. Men gathered tools for work in the fields. Older family members prepared bread dough while smoke drifted softly upward through roof openings. The kingdom depended upon these quiet routines. Without them, nothing else could function. Temples could not receive grain offerings. Cities could not feed their populations. Officials could not collect taxes. Armies could not march. The entire structure rested upon ordinary labor repeated carefully every single day. As the eastern sky brightened slowly, figures began moving through the village streets more frequently now. Sandals brushed softly across dusty ground. Donkeys shifted beneath early loads of vegetables and reeds prepared for transport. Voices remained low. People saved their energy. The heat would arrive soon enough. In the distance, fields stretched beside the Nile in dark green bands surrounded by endless desert. Irrigation canals reflected the first pale light of dawn while insects hovered above still water. These canals required constant maintenance. Every season brought damage somewhere. Mud walls weakened. Water channels became blocked with silt. Banks collapsed after flooding. And so crews of workers spent much of their lives repairing the same systems again and again. The work could feel endless because it truly was endless. Nothing stayed fixed for long in Egypt except the rhythm of maintenance itself. A farmer who repaired one section of canal today might return months later to repair it again after flood waters shifted the earth beneath it. This repetition shaped the minds of workers as much as their bodies. Patience became necessary for survival. Acceptance became easier than resistance. Many people likely stopped expecting life to change dramatically at all. The same fields fed each generation. The same labor passed from parent to child. The same officials arrived to count grain and organize work crews. Even suffering became familiar enough to feel ordinary. As sunrise finally touched the tops of palm trees along the river, the valley slowly turned gold. Mist lifted from the water. Birds crossed overhead in loose drifting patterns. The coolness of morning began fading already beneath growing warmth. Farmers moved into the fields with tools resting across their shoulders. Some carried wooden hoes polished smooth by years of handling. Others guided oxen toward plows waiting beside damp soil. The work began quietly. No dramatic commands. No sudden rush. Just slow steady movement spreading across the land. In Egypt, labor often appeared calm from a distance because people had learned to conserve energy carefully. Sudden effort beneath the desert sun could exhaust the body quickly. Experienced workers moved with deliberate rhythm instead. Dig. Lift. Carry. Pause. Continue. Hour after hour. Near one irrigation canal, an older farmer crouched beside a damaged embankment inspecting cracks left behind after recent water flow. His hands were rough and darkened from decades spent outdoors. Deep lines marked his face beneath the growing sunlight. Beside him worked his son, still young enough to move with greater speed but already carrying the same quiet seriousness common among adults in the village. Few people wasted movement or words unnecessarily. The day itself demanded enough from them already. Farther along the Nile, transport boats had begun their journeys as well. Large wooden vessels drifted northward with the current carrying grain, stone, papyrus reeds, pottery, and countless other goods needed throughout the kingdom. Sailcloth fluttered gently in the morning breeze while crews adjusted ropes with practiced hands. The river connected everything. Villages, cities, temples, work sites, royal estates. Messages and supplies moved along the Nile the way blood moves through a body, carrying life from place to place across the kingdom. And because transport mattered so much, river activity was closely watched and organized. Harbors collected taxes. Officials inspected cargo. Deliveries were recorded carefully by scribes waiting along busy docks. Even the river itself became part of the kingdom's system of quiet control. In larger towns, marketplaces slowly awakened beneath the rising sun. Merchants arranged goods upon woven mats while bakers removed fresh loaves from hot ovens. The smell of bread mixed with dust, fish, smoke, and river mud drifting through narrow streets. A potter opened the shutters of his workshop and stepped outside to stretch tired muscles before beginning another long day shaping clay beside the wheel. Nearby, a linen weaver prepared thread while seated inside a shaded doorway. Her fingers moved automatically through familiar motions learned during childhood. Thread pulled tight. Fibers twisted carefully. The loom waiting nearby. The work of hands filled ancient Egypt from morning until night. Hands planting grain. Hands carving stone. Hands carrying water. Hands recording taxes upon papyrus. The kingdom itself seemed built from endless human touch repeated over centuries. As the morning grew hotter, scribes arrived inside government offices where cooler interiors protected scrolls and records from direct sunlight. Papyrus sheets were unrolled carefully across low desks while jars of ink sat nearby. Outside, laborers sweated beneath the sun. Inside, scribes worked beneath shade. Yet their lives were still ruled by obligation and discipline. A scribe could not simply ignore records or invent numbers carelessly. Administrative systems depended upon accuracy. Grain measurements affected taxation. Labor assignments affected construction schedules. Supply records affected temple operations and royal storage houses. Every detail connected to something larger. And so the scribes wrote steadily for hours. Brushes scratching softly. Ink drying slowly in warm air. Lists growing longer across pale papyrus surfaces. Many ordinary people feared paperwork in the same quiet way later societies would fear official documents and tax collectors. Written records carried authority that could not easily be argued against. A number recorded by a scribe became reality. A debt written down remained real. A labor obligation assigned on papyrus could pull a man away from his home for weeks or months. Most villagers could not read these records themselves. They simply trusted or feared the people who could. By midday, Egypt shimmered beneath intense sunlight. Heat radiated from stone walls and dusty roads. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while seeking brief moments of shade whenever possible. Animals slowed their movement. Conversations became shorter. The sun controlled the pace of life more powerfully than any official ever could. Still, the officials remained present everywhere beneath that heat. Inspecting work crews. Monitoring storehouses. Checking deliveries. Maintaining the structure that kept the kingdom orderly. In one large granary near the river, workers carried sacks of grain up wooden ramps into enormous storage rooms lined with mud brick walls. Dust floated thickly through hot air while overseers counted deliveries aloud. The grain smelled dry and earthy. Sweat soaked through linen clothing. Shoulders strained beneath heavy loads. Yet the workers moved patiently because this labor was deeply familiar to them. Egyptian society depended upon storing surplus grain carefully against years of poor flooding or drought. Granaries became symbols of security and state power alike. Whoever controlled grain controlled survival. And so grain was measured carefully, protected carefully, taxed carefully. Nothing important in Egypt escaped organization for very long. As afternoon slowly stretched onward, exhaustion settled across the land once again. The same exhaustion that had shaped generations before, and would shape generations still to come beside the patient river flowing quietly through the heart of the kingdom. The afternoon heat rested heavily over Egypt like a great invisible weight. By this hour, even the wind seemed tired. Dust hung motionless above narrow roads. Palm leaves barely moved against the pale sky. Along the riverbanks, the Nile reflected bright sunlight so intensely that fishermen narrowed their eyes against the glare while adjusting nets with slow, careful hands. Across the fields, workers continued their labor beneath the burning sun. No one expected comfort from the day. Comfort belonged mostly to evening and night. Daylight belonged to work. A farmer standing ankle-deep in damp soil wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm before bending once more toward the irrigation channel in front of him. The mud beneath his feet felt warm now, softened by water and trampled smooth by years of labor. Nearby, another man guided a wooden water-lifting device with steady movements. Up and down. Up and down. The creaking wood blended with the soft splash of water pouring into narrow canals that carried life toward thirsty crops. This work demanded patience more than strength. A hurried worker wasted energy. An experienced worker learned rhythm. Steady breathing. Measured movement. The body adapting itself to endless repetition beneath the heat. Children often worked beside adults from a young age, not always because of cruelty, but because labor was simply part of life. A boy might carry baskets of soil. A girl might help gather reeds or bring water to relatives working in the fields. The entire family became part of the day's effort. And through this shared labor, children slowly absorbed the structure of Egyptian society without needing long explanations. They learned by watching, by carrying, by repeating. A child growing up beside the Nile understood early that survival depended upon cooperation and routine. Everyone had responsibilities. Everyone belonged somewhere within the larger pattern surrounding them. The kingdom itself felt distant most of the time. Many villagers would never see the pharaoh directly. They might only know him through statues, temple carvings, official announcements, and the authority carried by local administrators acting in his name. Yet his presence still shaped their lives. Taxes collected from their grain supported royal projects. Labor obligations connected them to state construction. Religious rituals reinforced the idea that the pharaoh maintained balance between gods and humanity. The king became less a person and more a symbol of order itself. And ordinary people, living quiet lives beside the river, moved within that order like water moving through irrigation channels already carved into the earth. Farther north along the Nile, large construction sites remained active despite the heat. Workers hauling limestone blocks leaned their weight against ropes while overseers shouted measured instructions from shaded positions nearby. The stones moved slowly. Everything moved slowly under such heat. Dust clung to sweaty skin and entered mouths, noses, and eyes. Men paused often to drink water from clay jars stored beneath cloth coverings meant to keep them cool. The labor looked exhausting because it was exhausting. Yet many of these workers were not chained prisoners as later stories sometimes imagined. They were organized laborers, craftsmen, seasonal workers, and men fulfilling obligations to the state. Some received food, clothing, beer, and shelter in exchange for their labor. Others worked because local authorities demanded participation. Control did not always require visible force. The expectation itself carried power. Most people obeyed because disobedience threatened stability, punishment, or loss of support within tightly connected communities. And so the monuments rose slowly over generations. Stone by stone. Block by block. Human hands shaping structures meant to outlive everyone who built them. Inside shaded carving workshops near one temple complex, artisans sat cross-legged while smoothing details into stone reliefs. Their tools clicked softly against limestone surfaces. Tiny chips of pale rock gathered around their feet. One worker carved rows of hieroglyphs carefully into a temple wall. Another shaped the outline of a bird with delicate precision. Nearby, an apprentice watched quietly while preparing fresh tools and clearing dust from the floor. Training in skilled crafts often lasted many years. Knowledge passed slowly from experienced hands to younger ones. Mistakes were corrected patiently because precision mattered deeply in Egyptian art and construction. Tradition guided proportions, symbols, colors, and placement. Art was not meant to express personal emotion freely. It existed to preserve order, identity, and continuity. Even beauty followed rules. Especially beauty. As afternoon drifted toward evening, shadows lengthened gradually across courtyards and roads. Workers began slowing naturally as the worst heat finally softened. In market districts, activity increased again after the quieter midday hours. Merchants reopened shaded stalls fully while townspeople moved through narrow streets purchasing supplies for evening meals. The smell of baked bread returned to the air. So did the smell of fish cooked over charcoal fires. A woman carrying onions and lentils in woven baskets walked carefully past a line of donkeys loaded with pottery jars waiting for transport. Nearby, two boys argued softly over a game scratched into the dirt while an elderly man rested against a mud brick wall watching the crowd with tired eyes. Life in Egypt could feel crowded in towns, but rarely chaotic. There was movement. Noise. Dust. Animals. Trade. Yet beneath it all remained the familiar structure that organized behavior and expectation. People understood where they could go, what they could say, whom they should obey. The boundaries of life were visible even when no one spoke about them directly. As the sun lowered closer toward the horizon, workers in the fields finally began gathering tools for the day's end. A farmer lifted his wooden hoe onto his shoulder and looked briefly across the irrigation canals glowing orange beneath sunset light. The water moved gently between rows of crops while insects hovered above the surface. He was tired in the deep physical way that comes from long repetitive labor. His back hurt. His hands ached. Tomorrow would feel much the same. And yet there was comfort in returning home now. Even simple homes offered relief from the endless demands of daylight labor. In one village beside the Nile, smoke rose from rooftops as evening cooking began. Children carried small bundles of reeds for fuel while mothers prepared dough and stirred clay pots over open fires. The smell of warm grain drifted softly through narrow streets. Inside a nearby home, an older woman sat weaving by lamplight while speaking quietly to her granddaughter about family members long gone now. Her hands continued moving automatically across the loom as she spoke. Thread crossing thread. Pattern following pattern. Much of Egyptian life depended upon memory carried through repetition. Skills survived because they were practiced constantly. Stories survived because they were spoken repeatedly. Traditions survived because people feared disorder more than routine. And perhaps that fear was understandable. Beyond the fertile Nile Valley stretched enormous desert emptiness where little could survive easily. The green riverbanks felt precious against such harsh surroundings. stability mattered deeply because the alternative could seem frighteningly fragile. A failed flood. A damaged harvest. Political unrest. These things threatened survival itself. So order became sacred. And ordinary people carried that sacred order quietly through their daily routines. As darkness slowly spread across the land once again, temple bells echoed faintly through evening air while priests prepared nighttime rituals inside massive stone sanctuaries. Oil lamps illuminated painted columns decorated with lotus flowers and sacred symbols. Incense smoke curled upward beneath towering ceilings where carved stars covered dark blue surfaces meant to resemble the heavens. The temples held enormous wealth and influence. Land. Storehouses. Livestock. Workshops. Servants. Priests managed all of it through systems as organized as those used by royal administrators. Religion and government were deeply connected in Egypt. Sacred authority strengthened political authority, and political stability protected religious tradition. Together, they formed the structure surrounding everyday life. A structure so old and familiar that many people probably could not imagine society existing differently. Outside the temple walls, night settled gently across villages and fields. The heat faded little by little. Families gathered together beneath open skies or inside dimly lit rooms where exhaustion softened conversations into silence. One by one, lamps went dark. Children slept first. Then parents. Then the village itself. Only the Nile remained awake beneath the moonlight, flowing steadily through the center of the kingdom as it had for countless generations before. Its waters carried boats silently through darkness. Past sleeping farms. Past silent temples. Past workers resting their tired bodies before another day of labor. And beneath the vast ancient sky filled with stars, Egypt drifted once more into quiet night, held together by routine, patience, and the calm unbroken rhythm of controlled lives beside the river. The moon hung low above the Nile, pale and quiet against the dark sky. Its light touched the river softly, turning the moving water into silver ribbons that slipped between shadowed banks lined with reeds and sleeping boats. The air carried the scent of mud, smoke, and cooling stone. Somewhere far off, a jackal cried briefly in the desert before silence settled once more across the valley. Night in ancient Egypt moved slowly. It stretched gently over the land like linen laid across tired bodies. For the people sleeping in villages beside the river, these hours were precious. The heat had finally faded enough for deep rest. Muscles loosened. Breathing slowed. The endless demands of labor paused for a little while beneath the stars. Inside one small home, an old farmer lay awake longer than the others around him. His wife and grandchildren already slept nearby, their forms dim beneath woven blankets. But age often changed sleep. Years of labor left his joints stiff and aching at night, and sometimes he simply listened to the quiet world around him while waiting for rest to return. He could hear the faint movement of wind outside. The soft shifting of reeds. The distant splash of water against wood. Sounds he had known his entire life. Perhaps his father had listened to these same sounds. And his grandfather before that. The thought itself might not have seemed remarkable to him. In Egypt, continuity felt natural. Life repeated so steadily that generations often blended together in memory, each one following nearly the same rhythms as the last. The same river. The same fields. The same labor beneath the same sun. And always the same expectation that each person would fulfill their role quietly and properly. The old man closed his eyes eventually, and the village returned fully to silence. Only a few people remained awake now. Temple guards walking slow paths beside sacred walls. boat crews navigating carefully through moonlit water, bakers preparing ovens long before dawn, and certain laborers whose schedules followed the needs of transport, trade, or construction rather than the rising sun alone. Near one riverside dock, several men unloaded cargo from a broad wooden vessel that had traveled downstream during the cooler night hours. Clay jars filled with oil and grain were carried carefully onto the shore while a scribe nearby recorded quantities beneath flickering lamplight. Even in darkness, the machinery of Egypt continued working. Quietly. Methodically. A misplaced shipment mattered. A missing jar mattered. An incorrect number mattered. And so the scribe bent over his papyrus with patient concentration while insects circled the small flame beside him. His back hurt from long hours sitting cross-legged. His eyes burned from dim light. Yet his records would become part of the kingdom's memory by morning. Everything was written down somewhere. The Egyptian state depended upon records the way the fields depended upon water. Without organization, the system could not maintain itself. Without accurate counting, food supplies might fail to reach the right places. Without supervision, labor forces could not support the enormous building projects that stretched across generations. And so the writing continued. Always the writing. Long after midnight, the eastern sky slowly began changing once more. At first the difference was barely noticeable. A faint thinning of darkness near the horizon. The stars nearest the earth losing some of their sharpness. Then gradually the shape of the land emerged again. Palm trees. Temple walls. Boats resting along the riverbank. Another day approached Egypt. And with it came the return of movement. In farming villages, women woke first in many households. They rose quietly so as not to disturb sleeping children while preparing the morning's first tasks. Grinding stones were lifted into place. Water jars inspected. Embers stirred back to life beneath clay ovens. The sound of grain being crushed slowly filled the cool dawn air. Stone against stone. Again and again. The rhythm was so common across Egypt that it became part of the morning itself. Many women spent countless hours over the course of their lives grinding grain. The work wore down shoulders, knees, wrists, and back slowly over time. Archaeologists would later study ancient skeletons and find clear signs of this repeated strain. But in those distant mornings beside the Nile, the women likely thought little about such things. There was simply work to do. Always work to do. Nearby, a young mother braided her daughter's hair while bread dough rested beneath cloth beside the oven. The child still looked sleepy, leaning gently against her mother's arm while birds outside began greeting the sunrise. Soon the little girl would help carry water. Soon she would learn weaving. Soon she would begin taking on small household duties of her own. Childhood in Egypt often blended gradually into labor rather than standing apart from it. Children learned by joining the routines around them little by little. And because these routines rarely changed, life could feel strangely timeless. As sunlight finally spread across the Nile Valley, the world brightened quickly. The river turned gold beneath the rising sun. Mist lifted from irrigation canals. Workers appeared along dusty roads carrying tools across their shoulders. The kingdom awakened once again. In one field beside the river, several farmers inspected flood marks left behind from the previous season. The soil here remained rich and dark, perfect for planting, but maintaining productive land required constant attention. A canal wall had weakened nearby. Already the men discussed repairs while kneeling beside the damaged section. More mud bricks would be needed. More labor. More time beneath the sun. Maintenance never ended in Egypt because the environment itself demanded endless care. The desert waited beyond the fertile strip of land surrounding the Nile. Without irrigation and organized agriculture, the green valley could disappear beneath dryness and sand. Perhaps this was one reason Egyptians valued order so deeply. They lived beside visible evidence of how fragile life could become without it. The fertile world around them did not happen naturally on its own. It was maintained, protected, managed carefully year after year. And ordinary workers carried much of that burden upon their shoulders. As morning grew warmer, transport boats filled the river once again. Some carried grain taxes toward government storehouses. Others transported stone blocks from quarries farther south. Merchants moved goods between settlements while officials monitored important trade routes from busy river ports. The Nile was peaceful to look at, but economically it was the beating heart of the kingdom. Without river transport, Egypt's systems of control would have weakened greatly. Roads through the desert were difficult and dangerous for large cargo movement. The river allowed communication, taxation, labor organization, and trade to function across enormous distances. And so the state paid close attention to everything that traveled upon it. At one riverside checkpoint, a local official stood beneath a shaded awning while workers unloaded baskets of grain from a transport boat. Nearby, a scribe sat beside a low table recording numbers carefully onto papyrus. The official himself wore cleaner linen than the laborers around him. His hands showed fewer signs of physical work. Yet his life too belonged to the system. He answered to higher authorities. He followed procedures established long before his own appointment. He maintained order within his assigned district because order itself formed the foundation of Egyptian power. Without organization, even officials lost security. As midday approached, heat returned heavily across the land. Fields shimmered beneath bright sunlight. Stone walls radiated warmth. The smell of dust rose from roads where sandals and animal hooves passed constantly through loose earth. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads and continued. Because stopping entirely was rarely possible. A construction crew near a temple complex strained together pulling a limestone block across wooden sledges while overseers coordinated movement carefully. The stone groaned softly against the wood. Ropes tightened. Bare feet pressed into hot ground. The monument rising before them would likely survive thousands of years. Most of the workers themselves would leave behind little trace except worn bones buried beneath desert sand. And yet their labor shaped Egypt as surely as kings and priests did. Perhaps more so. For it was ordinary people who carried the kingdom forward each day through endless repetition. The baker rising before dawn. The woman grinding grain. The farmer clearing irrigation channels. The boatman steering cargo through misty morning waters. The scribe recording taxes by lamplight. Together, they formed the quiet machinery beneath Egypt's calm and controlled surface. And beneath the endless blue sky of another ancient afternoon, the rhythm continued once again beside the patient flowing Nile. The evening settled softly over the Nile for one final time. The heat of the day slowly drifted away from the fields, leaving behind warm earth that still held the memory of sunlight. Reeds along the riverbank bent gently in the night breeze. Small fishing boats rocked quietly against their ropes while distant lamps flickered beside dark water. Across the villages of ancient Egypt, doors closed one by one. Cooking fires faded into glowing embers. Children, exhausted from long days beneath the sun, slept soundly beside their families. Farmers rested their aching backs against woven mats. Mothers finally grew still after endless hours of grinding grain, carrying water, weaving cloth, and tending to the quiet needs of the household. The kingdom itself seemed to grow sleepy. Temple courtyards emptied beneath moonlight. Marketplaces became silent. Even the scribes put down their brushes at last, leaving unfinished lines of ink drying slowly upon papyrus scrolls. And above it all, the stars spread endlessly across the Egyptian sky. The same stars that watched over stone temples, over dusty roads, over workers in the fields, over boats drifting silently along the river. For thousands of years, life beside the Nile moved in gentle repetition. Morning labor, midday heat, evening rest, night silence. Again and again, like water flowing endlessly through familiar channels. Most people lived quiet lives. Small lives. Lives shaped by duty, routine, and the calm weight of order surrounding them from birth until old age. They woke before sunrise. Worked beneath the endless desert sun. Returned home tired. And rested beneath soft night air while the river continued moving patiently through darkness. And now the Nile grows quiet once more. The lamps dim lower. The warm wind moves softly through the reeds. Somewhere far away, water touches the shore with a slow gentle rhythm. And ancient Egypt drifts peacefully into sleep beneath the stars.